They said the war ended in '45, but in the shadows of the battlefield, deeper truths were buried. What if the heroes weren't so innocent, and the silence wasn't peace, but a warning? This isn't history from the textbooks. This is the story they never wanted you to find, until now. They called themselves Edelweiss, Edelweiss, the symbol of purity and honor. But by the time the war ended, those who wore the insignia of the 17th SS Gebirgsjäger Division, Schwarz Edelweiss, had become phantoms, shadows drifting through the mountains of memory and regret. Formed in the spring of 1942, the Schwarz Edelweiss Division drew its recruits from the alpine villages of Austria and southern Germany. They were climbers, hunters, and guides, men who had grown up on snow-covered slopes and among whispered folk legends of the highlands. Their commanding officer, Obersturmbannführer Dieter Ressel, a World War I veteran and expert mountaineer, believed in the old codes, discipline, loyalty, and honor. But war has a way of corrupting even the cleanest air. Their baptism of fire came in the harsh terrain of the Caucasus, sent to support Operation Edelweiss, Hitler's ill-fated drive toward the Baku oil fields. There, the Schwarz Edelweiss discovered that the myths of their own invincibility could not shield them from Soviet sniper fire, avalanches, or frostbite. Villagers from remote Georgian hamlets remembered them as the silent devils, disciplined, brutal, and efficient. They took no prisoners, citing orders from Berlin, but behind the crisp language of command, some soldiers confessed in their journals a growing sickness in the soul. A letter smuggled out by a nurse named Anya Wiebel described the aftermath of a partisan attack near the Elbrus foothills. They hanged the villagers. 21. The youngest couldn't have been older than my brother. The men said it was necessary. Dieter just looked at the snow, as if trying to remember where he'd left himself behind. By late 1943, the division was transferred to northern Italy, tasked with suppressing partisan activity around the Dolomites. What began as counterinsurgency became reprisal. For every German soldier killed in an ambush, 10 Italians, fighters or not, were executed. Villages such as Pontebello and Monte Castello were burned, their residents vanished into the woods or shallow graves. But among the bloodshed, quiet moments flickered. A soldier named Elias Morgenstern sketching the ruined frescoes of a burned church, an officer slipping food to a starving child, only to be shot the next day by partisans. Then came the winter retreat of 1944 from the Eastern Front, as the Red Army surged westward. The Schwarz Edelweiss, battered and broken, was thrown into the meat grinder around Lviv. Their beloved commander, Ressel, was killed in a Soviet artillery barrage. Leadership passed to Hauptsturmführer Heinrich Moser, a man whose ruthlessness masked his paranoia. Under his command, the division turned inward. Executions for cowardice increased. Soldiers who tried to surrender were shot. Deserters were crucified against barn doors with rusted wire. In April 1945, as Nazi Germany crumbled, what remained of the division retreated into the Austrian Alps. The war was lost, and they knew it. Some threw away their uniforms and disappeared into forests. Others dug in, planning to hold mountain passes that no longer mattered. One group, led by former Lieutenant Jacob Frisch, stumbled upon an abandoned monastery near Zell MC. There, amid snowdrifts and silence, they waited, claiming they were preserving Germanic purity until the next Reich arose. Most were found dead by U.S. troops weeks later, starved, some by suicide, one by gunshot to the back of the head. But not all the division was accounted for. In 1963, a journalist named Marta Koenig, whose grandfather had been executed in Pontebello, began investigating the story of the Schwarz Edelweiss. In alpine villages, she found whispered recollections of the ghost captain, who returned each year to light candles on anonymous graves. In the records of the U.S. occupation forces, she found the name Elias Morgenstern, listed as a translator and art consultant, before he vanished from military files in 1947. Koenig's search led her to a forgotten chapel carved into the rock of the Seisenberg Gorge. There, hidden behind a loose stone, she found a box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, 24 letters written by Morgenstern to his sister, all unsent. They told of a man trying to hold on to his humanity in a time when decency was dangerous. He described painting over swastikas in abandoned churches, sketching the faces of villagers before they were taken, and the unbearable weight of silence that followed each atrocity. One letter read, "I no longer dream of mountains, only of eyes, watching, judging. I think the snow itself remembers us, and curses us with every thaw." Koenig never published the letters in full. Some say she was threatened by former SS men who had integrated into post-war Austrian life. Others say she simply couldn't bear to reopen the wounds. She passed away in 1981. The letters were donated anonymously to the National Archives in 1997. Today, in the village of Pontebello, there stands a single white stone marked only with the carved symbol of the Edelweiss flower. No name, no rank, just silence. When asked about the memorial, an old woman who remembered the occupation said, "We built it not for them, but for ourselves, to remember how close we came to becoming like them." And so the echo lingers in stone and snow, in brushstrokes and unsent letters, the memory of men who marched into the mountains wearing white flowers and came down marked in black. In the damp English winter of 1943, the corridors of Bletchley Park hummed with quiet urgency. Hut 8, home to the most secretive of Britain's wartime code-breaking efforts, was alive with typewriters, logic puzzles, and the relentless tapping of minds against the stubborn wall of the German Enigma cipher. Among the hundreds working under absolute secrecy was Eleanor Finch, a mathematics prodigy from Oxford with a fondness for cryptic crosswords and strong black tea. Her name would vanish from records before the war ended. Eleanor was 26, sharp-featured, with an intense, unreadable stare. She joined the government code and cipher school after an unspectacular academic career that belied her gift for pattern recognition. Alan Turing noticed her first, during a wartime crossword competition meant to spot unusual minds. She solved his constructed cipher in 23 minutes, half the time of the next best. Within weeks, she was cleared under the Official Secrets Act and assigned to a team decoding Kriegsmarine messages. She spent hours staring at jumbles of letters that to others meant nothing. But Eleanor began to notice anomalies, a repeated string of nonsense within a subgroup of U-boat transmissions. While her colleagues dismissed it as radio interference, she became obsessed. What if it was not noise, but a signal? Over the next 6 weeks, she began mapping what she would later refer to in her journal as the Ash cipher, a possible layer of communication buried under the German Navy's Enigma. Then came the breakthrough. In April 1944, Eleanor deciphered a series of messages referencing transportation movements near Chelmno, Treblinka, and Auschwitz. They were never explicit, but the context was unmistakable. Prisoners, selection codes, timetables. She brought her findings to her superior, Commander Geoffrey Menzies, expecting action. Instead, he scowled, ordered her findings sealed, and reassigned her to cipher maintenance in Hut 4. That night, Eleanor vanished from the dormitories. Her bunk was made. Her teacup was still warm. No suitcase was missing. No note was left. The official report stated she had suffered a nervous episode and had been transferred to a convalescent facility in Scotland. But her closest friend, Margaret Hale, a fellow codebreaker and Eleanor's discreet romantic partner, received a single and signed postcard a month later. It showed a church in Vienna. On the back was a quote in Latin, "Veritas liberabit vos," "The truth shall set you free." After the war, Margaret began searching. She filed inquiries. She wrote to MI6. Nothing. Then, in 1951, she received a second postcard, this time postmarked Berlin. It contained a drawing in Eleanor's unmistakable hand, a chessboard with only 2 pieces, a white queen and a black pawn. The implication was chilling. Eleanor was alive, or had been, and someone was watching. Then came a flurry of unexpected revelations. In 1964, during a Soviet defector debriefing, MI5 was handed a dossier referencing Operative Chimera, a British cryptologist allegedly captured by the NKVD in 1944 and used to interpret intercepted Allied intelligence during the final months of the war. The description matched Eleanor, young, female, high-ranking clearance, suspected sexual deviance, uncooperative but linguistically skilled. British intelligence denied all knowledge. But a BBC researcher, Lucy Thorne, fascinated by Eleanor's disappearance, began her own investigation. In an attic in Cambridge, she discovered the wartime notebooks of Margaret Hale, who had died in 1968. Among them, transcripts of conversations, annotated codes, and sketches of what she believed was the Ash cipher. One page contained a phrase repeated over and over: "She told the truth too early." Thorne tracked down retired American OSS officer Charles Winslow in Maine. He confirmed that a woman from Bletchley had been mentioned in post-war CIA briefings as a wild card, unaccounted for. According to Winslow, she had intercepted something at Bletchley, something relating not just to the Holocaust, but to Allied knowledge of it, long before the public confessions at the Nuremberg trials. Rumors swirled that Eleanor had been passed to the Soviets in a quiet deal to protect the Allies' monopoly on atomic secrets, that she had been killed by British intelligence to prevent diplomatic damage, that she had escaped into East Germany and continued working in secret for decades, feeding misinformation to both sides during the Cold War. The final piece of the puzzle surfaced in 1995, when the Berlin Wall had long since fallen. A historian cataloging East German archives uncovered a surveillance file from the 1970s. It referenced a woman known only as Die Spielerin, the player. She lived in Leipzig, played chess in the park with former Soviet officers, and occasionally received letters from abroad bearing crossword puzzles. Her real name was never discovered, but a photograph included in the file, though grainy, bore an uncanny resemblance to Eleanor Finch. And yet, her fate remained unconfirmed. In 2009, Bletchley Park opened an exhibit dedicated to forgotten codebreakers. Among the honored names was Eleanor's. Her photo, framed in black, sits beside a display of handwritten cipher pages. On one, tucked in the corner, are the faint pencil markings of her own creation, the Ash cipher. Visitors often ask what it meant. The curators answer honestly, "We still don't know. Maybe it was a key. Maybe it was a warning. Or maybe it was a silence too dangerous to break." On a freezing October morning in 1943, beneath the choking haze of burning buildings and the muffled cries echoing beyond the Warsaw Ghetto walls, a man with paint-stained hands and a soot-darkened coat delivered a canvas to the headquarters of a German logistics officer. The painting, a somber depiction of a withered orchid lying on cracked stone, was accepted without question. Days later, a train carrying 72 children, disguised as Catholic orphans, slipped out of the city unnoticed. That man was Józef Kosinski, once a celebrated modernist painter, now a ghost moving through the ruins of occupied Poland. The Nazis had banned his work. His galleries had been seized. His studio torched. But Kosinski had found a new purpose, using his art to smuggle life past death. The Polish underground called it Operation Fire Orchid. At its heart was a network of artists, teachers, doctors, and railway workers who crafted elaborate forgeries, baptismal certificates, travel papers, German passes. But Kosinski's role was unique. His paintings became vehicles of deception, each concealing information within layers of oil and varnish. Names of children, train schedules, routes across the countryside, code phrases embedded in seemingly abstract brushwork. To the Gestapo, they were harmless portraits or gloomy still lives. To those in the resistance, they were instructions, if you knew how to read them. The name, Fire Orchid, came from one of his early pieces, painted after witnessing a transport from the ghetto. In his diary he wrote, **, the children looked like they'd bloomed in fire, fragile, bright, doomed. The world turned its head. I won't. **. Józef was no hero in the classical sense. He drank too much. He had once been arrested for slapping a German officer at a cabaret. But he was fearless. His contacts included Catholic nuns, Jewish smuggler rings, and even a disillusioned Wehrmacht quartermaster named Hans Keller, who ensured certain cargo checks went missing when shipments moved west. Among the most critical missions came in December 1943. Intelligence had surfaced that a new round of deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto was imminent. Over 200 children were hiding in the cellars of the old opera house, disguised as stagehands and set painters. Kosinski proposed a radical plan: smuggle them out under the cover of an art exhibition hosted for Nazi officers. He called the show The Twilight of Europa. The event took place in a confiscated gallery near Nowy Swiat. Kosinski displayed 20 large canvases, grim, surreal, drenched in symbolism. A swastika made of dead birds. A ballerina bleeding from her eyes. A crow standing on a toppled menorah. The German officers dismissed it as degenerate but fashionable, unaware that the event had a second act. As the reception drew their attention, couriers led the children out through the basement tunnel into waiting horse carts, disguised as art crates being returned to Berlin. Not every child made it. 7 were caught near Lodz. 2 more froze to death hiding in a hay wagon. But most reached safety. Kosinski disappeared for weeks afterward, hiding in a barn and painting with mud on broken tiles. He emerged thinner, hollow-eyed, but determined. Then came betrayal. In March 1944, a young courier named Basha, just 16, was captured and tortured by the Gestapo. Names spilled. A safe house was raided. Kosinski's friend, Dr. Abram Nowak, was executed in front of his family. Josef fled to the Praga district, where he found shelter with an old flame, a sculptor named Lena Szymborska. From there, the operation continued, though diminished. The children became harder to hide. German checkpoints grew more ruthless. By summer, only small groups could be moved. Kosinski's paintings became darker, more abstract, blobs of black spiraling around red centers. One, titled The Hollow Orchestra, depicted a conductor with no face. Hidden within it was a route through the sewers leading to a safe house near the Vistula. In August, as the Warsaw Uprising erupted, Kosinski fought alongside the Home Army. Armed with a stolen pistol and a pack of cigarettes, he painted numbers on barricades to guide wounded resistance fighters to hidden clinics. Witnesses recalled him walking through sniper fire with a bucket of red paint, drawing arrows along cobblestones. He refused to carry a weapon after the first week, saying, "My brush is deadlier than bullets." He was last seen during a German firebombing raid, dragging 3 children into a basement beneath the ruined synagogue on Naluki Street. 4 years after the war, Kosinski was presumed dead. But in 1958, a Belgian art collector unveiled a painting at an exhibition in Brussels titled Orchid number 47. It bore his signature. Embedded in the corner was a fingerprint, and a date, April 1945. Over the next decade, more of his lost works surfaced across Europe, each one darker than the last, and all bearing subtle marks of the operation. One showed a boy riding a train with stars instead of wheels. Another depicted a staircase descending into a mouth shaped like a smokestack. Cryptographers later realized the brush patterns matched those found in the Ash cipher, a possible link to Bletchley Park. Some believe Kosinski had been smuggled out by British intelligence to work as a consultant. Others insist he lived in hiding, haunted by ghosts and survivors. In 1997, during renovations of a Warsaw church used by the resistance, workers found a hollow brick behind the altar. Inside was a rolled canvas, untouched by time. The painting showed a garden of orchids on fire, and beneath it, a single sentence scrawled in Polish. Art is the lie that lets the truth survive. Today, at the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews, a room is dedicated to Operation Fire Orchid. On its walls hang 5 of Kosinski's surviving works. No one knows how many others remain hidden, waiting to tell the stories of the children they once saved. In the vast, wind-swept emptiness of the Aleutian Islands, where the Pacific lashes the cliffs with endless fury and the skies blur between storm and silence, a classified project once took flight. It was called Project Zephyr. Officially, it never existed. But in the journals of a woman named Lieutenant Cora Winthrop, and in the broken fuselage found decades later buried beneath Alaskan ice, the story breathes again. The war in the Pacific was fought not only with aircraft carriers and amphibious assaults but with information, specifically, weather. As the Allies planned bombing runs over Japanese-held islands and mainland targets, the need for precise meteorological intelligence grew urgent. The Japanese had fortified much of the northern Pacific, making it nearly impossible to fly reconnaissance missions without risking exposure. So, in early 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces authorized an experimental unit comprised of highly skilled female pilots to do what traditional crews could not: fly silent, unarmed gliders into enemy proximity under cover of fog and gather atmospheric data. The program was kept secret even from most senior commanders. The logic was brutal and simple. If captured, the women would be disavowed. Lieutenant Cora Winthrop was a barnstormer before the war. Born in Montana, she grew up flying male planes over the Rockies, dodging storms and navigating by instinct. When war broke out, she joined the Women Air Force Service Pilots (WASP), but was soon pulled into a special assignment by a man in a gray trench coat who offered no name and asked only one question: "Can you fly without being seen?" Training for Project Zephyr took place in a derelict naval airstrip near Nome. The women flew modified Waco CG-4A gliders, stripped of everything unnecessary. Painted a dull gray to blend with cloud banks, the crafts were outfitted with primitive weather instruments, long-range cameras, and barely enough fuel to return. Their flights launched from U.S. submarines or remote airfields and often landed in isolated patches of tundra or on glacier shelves. Each mission was a gamble between intelligence and death. The first few flights were promising. Cora and her wingmate, Lieutenant Bernice Halston, flew low over the Kuriles Islands in early May 1943, gathering cloud temperature data that directly influenced the planning of bombing runs on the Japanese base at Paramashiro. The success prompted the Pentagon to greenlight additional flights, now edging closer to Hokkaido itself. But by late 1943, Japanese radar and fighter patrols had become more aggressive. One glider was intercepted over the Sea of Okhotsk. The pilot, Lieutenant Nancy Dupre, was never found. Her wrecked craft was later recovered by a fishing vessel, riddled with bullet holes and stripped of its weather canisters. The surviving Zephyr pilots knew their odds. They flew anyway. Cora's journals, recovered years later from a storage unit in Butte, Montana, paint a picture of a unit both fearless and fractured. She writes of Bernice weeping silently after each flight, of the nightmares that haunted their tiny bunks, of the frostbite that turned fingers black and nerves numb. But she also writes of laughter, of harmonica duets by moonlight, of a prank that turned a general's boots into ice sculptures, of the way the sky opened like a cathedral above the clouds. In December 1944, Project Zephyr received its most dangerous directive: fly beyond the Kuriles and obtain pressure and wind readings above Tokyo. The mission, intended to support what would eventually become the firebombing raids of 1945, was considered borderline suicidal. Cora volunteered. So did Bernice. Their glider launched from the deck of the USS Cuttlefish in the early hours of December 17th. They cleared Japanese radar, made their readings, and turned back. They never returned. For years, nothing was known of their fate. Project Zephyr was officially dissolved in February 1945. The women's files were sealed, and their names were left off rosters, medals, and obituaries. Families were told they died in training accidents. The government buried the project beneath layers of red tape and silence. But in 1987, a Russian survey team exploring glacier shifts in the Kamchatka Peninsula discovered the twisted remains of a glider half buried in blue ice. Inside were two bodies, one still gripping the controls. A diary was found, protected by a sealed tin box. It was Cora's. Her final entry, written in a trembling hand, read: "We saw the sunrise over Japan. I think we made it count. If you find us, tell them we weren't afraid." The discovery led to quiet acknowledgments by U.S. officials, though no formal apology or recognition was ever given. The surviving Zephyr pilots, now in their 60s and 70s, began to speak. In 1993, a private memorial was constructed on Attu Island, a metal sculpture of a woman's hand reaching skyward, clutching a glider's broken rudder. Only 9 pilots from Project Zephyr survived the war. Most returned to anonymity, raising families, working as teachers, mechanics, librarians. Some never flew again. In 2006, the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum unveiled an exhibit titled Wings in the Fog, dedicated to the forgotten women of Project Zephyr. At its center stands Cora's restored journal, open to the final page. The inscription beneath reads, Asterisk, when the world needed them, they flew into silence. Asterisk. When Vienna fell silent in May 1945, the city's broken facades echoed not only with the remnants of war, but with the soft, mournful strains of music. In the smoke-streaked salons and cracked ballrooms, the notes of Strauss waltzes mingled with the rubble. It was in this fractured Vienna that Clara Weiss returned, a Jewish cellist, once hailed as a prodigy, now a ghost stepping back into a life that had been incinerated. Before the war, Clara played with the Vienna Philharmonic and had performed before dignitaries across Europe. She vanished from public life in 1938, just after the Anschluss. Like many, she was rounded up, deported, and sent to Auschwitz. She survived by playing cello in the Women's Orchestra, a haunting ensemble that serenaded the condemned as they marched to the gas chambers. Her music saved her life. But it also marked her soul. Liberated by the Soviets in January 1945, she made her way back to Vienna on foot and train, arriving to a city split like a scar between four occupying powers: Soviet, American, British, and French. The Austrians she had once known were changed. Many had welcomed the Nazis. Her family was gone. Her home had been given to a Wehrmacht officer, and later to a Red Army captain. Yet Clara returned, carrying nothing but a battered cello case and a small, blood-stained sheet of Bach's Cello Suite No. 2. She found work at first playing in smoky cafes in the Soviet sector, places frequented by tired officers and opportunistic locals. Her music drew attention. Too much of it. A Soviet cultural officer, Major Alexander Malenkov, took an interest in her. He offered her food, shelter, and eventually, a position as the lead cellist in the Soviet-sponsored Vienna Cultural Orchestra. Clara accepted, reluctantly. What choice did she have? But she had not forgotten. Not the silence of the crematoria. Not the smiles of Viennese women as Jewish shops were broken. And certainly not the music that had once offered beauty, now tainted with complicity. By 1946, Clara began composing again. Her pieces were subtle, layered, drawing heavily on atonal traditions, but infused with coded messages. A melody that mimicked the rhythm of machine gun fire. A bassline in the pattern of Morse code for Lügen, lies. Audiences were captivated, but unnerved. One piece, the broken minuet, caused a Soviet officer to leave mid-concert. But it was her 1947 suite, the Waltz of the Iron Curtain, that set off alarms. Premiered in the French sector, the piece opened with a gentle Viennese waltz that gradually warped, descending into dissonance. At its core, it embedded variations of banned Hungarian resistance songs and subtle motifs from Jewish mourning prayers. Clara had composed it to expose the hypocrisy of liberation, to show that fascism hadn't died, it had merely changed flags. The performance caused a sensation. Audiences wept. Soviet officials demanded the orchestra pull the piece from future programs. Clara refused. 3 days later, she was detained during a nighttime walk near the Danube. Officially, she was questioned regarding Western sympathies. Unofficially, she was offered a choice: compose for the Soviet Cultural Bureau or disappear. She chose neither. Clara fled Vienna with forged papers, helped by an American journalist, Evelyn Moore, who had written about her after hearing her perform. They crossed into the U.S. zone disguised as Red Cross workers. From there, Evelyn smuggled her to Berlin, and eventually to Paris. For 5 years, Clara vanished from the public eye. But her music didn't. Underground salons in Berlin and Prague began circulating reel-to-reel tapes of forbidden compositions attributed only to the shadow cellist. One suite, Pieta for the Voiceless, contained a section where 4 cellos played simultaneously, each in a different key. The result was chaos, followed by sudden silence. Musicians understood it instantly. It was a requiem for Europe's lost conscience. Western intelligence took notice. The CIA viewed Clara's music as a propaganda opportunity. They sent agents to Paris to find her. One offered funding, concert tours, even protection. She refused. "I'm not your violin," she told the man. "I've already played in one hell." Then came 1953. Clara re-emerged in Vienna under a false name. She organized a one-night-only performance in a church that had once been used to store Nazi archives. The concert, titled Night Without a Key, featured musicians from all 4 occupied sectors. It was a political act as much as a musical one. The Soviets tried to shut it down. The Americans sent observers. No one stopped her. As Clara stepped on stage, wearing a black dress and a silver Star of David, silence fell. Then, the bow met the string. The music that followed has no surviving recordings. But those who were there described it as something that pulled open the soul and showed it what war had done. That night, a Soviet colonel tore up his party badge. An American translator wept uncontrollably. A British officer said afterward, "That woman just ended the war for me." After the concert, Clara disappeared again. Some say she returned to Paris. Others claim she died in a train station in Hungary, shot by a man in a gray coat. No grave has ever been confirmed. But in a modest museum in Vienna, there stands a cello, cracked, worn, still bearing the Auschwitz inventory number etched into its side. Beside it is a plaque with Clara's name, and a quote found scribbled in the margin of her final composition. Asterisk, "Freedom does not waltz. It stumbles, bleeds, and sings." Asterisk. You opened the box. Now the music won't stop. Behind the medals and monuments lies a world of secrets etched in silence. Some stories don't fade, they hide, waiting to be heard. The war may be over, but the truth has just begun to whisper.